Hello and welcome everybody back to the Power Wealth channel. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed and following. This channel gives you the real crypto intel before it hits the mainstream. This might be the most important video I've ever done about wealth and XRP, not because of a price target, but because of a mindset that quietly keeps people from ever crossing the line into real financial freedom. Most people think the entire point of investing is eventually selling. They believe money is only made when you exit. They believe the finish line is liquidation. And that single belief is why so many people touch wealth once and then never keep it. Here's the truth. When you study how long-term wealth actually behaves, you find that the people who gain real control over their time, their lifestyle, and their legacy don't build their lives around exits. They build their lives around assets that keep working without being dismantled. So today I want to walk you through a different way to think about XRP, not as a trade, not as a lottery ticket, but as a balance sheet asset and potentially as a piece of infrastructure. And before we go further, this is educational. I'm not telling you what to buy or sell. I'm explaining the mechanics of ownership, liquidity, and how capital behaves when it's thinking in decades, not weeks. We're in a macro transition right now, and it's bigger than crypto headlines. The global financial system is being forced to modernize. Debt burdens are heavy, growth is uneven, and liquidity cycles have become the dominant driver of risk assets. At the same time, settlement systems that were designed for a slower world are being asked to operate at the speed of the internet. When the plumbing strains, capital starts seeking efficiency. That's when you see institutions, regulators, and infrastructure bodies begin paying attention to the same category of assets. Not because they suddenly became curious, because something in the existing framework is no longer efficient enough to support what comes next. And here's the key point. When the system is stable, speculation dominates. When the system is stressed, structure matters. If you anchor your financial life on excitement, you end up reactive. If you anchor it on structure, you end up in control. Now let's build the foundation, because the foundation is where most people go wrong. One of the biggest misunderstandings in personal finance is the idea that income equals wealth. Income is temporary, ownership is enduring, liquidity feels powerful because it's visible. You can spend it, move it, show it, measure it, but liquidity is fragile. Once it's used, it's gone. Once it's taxed, it shrinks. Once it's spent, it has to be recreated. Ownership works differently. Ownership doesn't need to move to create value. It doesn't need to be converted to be useful. And it doesn't disappear just because you access the benefits of it. That's why truly wealthy individuals don't rush to sell appreciating assets. It's not because they're emotionally attached. It's because they understand that selling collapses optionality. Optionality is the hidden engine of wealth. When you sell, you make a permanent decision. You choose one outcome and eliminate every other future use of that asset. That is retail conditioning: buy, wait, sell, repeat. And there's nothing morally wrong with that. Sometimes taking profit is wise. Sometimes reducing risk is wise. Sometimes life requires liquidity. But if your entire wealth strategy is built around exits, you are building a life that depends on perfect timing. That is a fragile life. Once an asset reaches a certain scale and credibility, it stops being just a trade and starts functioning like infrastructure on your personal balance sheet. At that point, the reasoning shifts. The question stops being, how do I cash out? The question becomes, what does this asset allow me to do without giving it up? That's the mindset shift that separates short-term gains from long-term financial independence, because ownership gives you leverage. It gives you access. It gives you options that liquidity never will. Liquidity is a moment, ownership is a position. And when people say, what's the point if you never sell? What they're really saying is they've only been taught one way money can work. Selling is just one function of an asset. It's often the least efficient one. Once you understand that, you stop chasing exits and you start designing systems. Now this is where XRP becomes genuinely interesting and not in the way most people talk about it. Most conversations focus on price. How high can it go? When do I sell? Where is the top? But that's not how capital thinks. Capital asks a different question. What happens after an asset becomes valuable, widely recognized, and structurally important? Because at that point, selling is rarely the most interesting move. The wealth game changes when an asset becomes acceptable collateral. Think about how institutions operate. They don't liquidate valuable holdings just to fund operations. They use those holdings as collateral, they borrow against them, and they let the asset remain intact while liquidity does the work. They separate ownership from access. That distinction is everything. When an asset is appreciating and widely accepted as valuable, it can sit on the balance sheet and still provide spendable power. You're not extracting value by destroying ownership. You're extracting value by temporarily accessing liquidity. And this is where people get uncomfortable. Not because it's complex, but because it challenges conditioning. We are taught that the only way to enjoy the value of something is to sell it. That may be true when assets are small. It is not true when assets reach scale and credibility. At scale, assets don't need to be sold to be useful. They need to be positioned. Now let's connect this to crypto, because this is where the macro conversation becomes practical. Crypto is often treated like a casino. But the deeper story is that the world is digitizing value transfer. That includes money movement, settlement, clearing, and ultimately tokenization of assets. When that happens, certain digital assets become more than speculative instruments. They become functional. And when an asset becomes functional inside financial systems, ownership becomes more valuable than excitement, because systems account for what they depend on. If XRP continues evolving towards structural relevance in payment rails and liquidity provisioning, the conversation shifts. It becomes less about whether it pumps this month and more about whether it becomes a recognized liquidity tool. If that shift happens, the options available to holders expand dramatically. The first layer is liquidity access without liquidation. When you borrow, you typically do not trigger a taxable sale event because a loan is not income. You also do not give up ownership. And if the underlying asset continues to appreciate over time, the relative weight of that loan becomes lighter. This is why debt in the hands of disciplined asset holders behaves very differently than debt in the hands of consumers. Consumer debt funds, lifestyle, strategic debt fund systems, and this is where XRP stops being something you hope goes up and starts functioning like a balance sheet asset. If an asset becomes broadly recognized as structurally important, meaning it is used, relied upon, and integrated, then its role shifts. It's no longer something you just hold. It becomes something you can stand on. Liquidity sourced from an asset like that can be deployed intentionally, not emotionally, not recklessly intentionally. You can use that liquidity to acquire cash-flowing assets. You can use it to fund ventures that generate recurring revenue. You can use it to invest in systems that support your life without requiring constant attention. And the key point is this: the asset stays intact. You're not dismantling the foundation to live in the house. You're using the foundation to support the structure above it. This is how people end up with lifestyles that don't look like they match their income, because income isn't the driver, access is. And over time, when the underlying asset appreciates and borrowed liquidity is deployed productively, the structure starts feeding itself. That is not hype, that is balance sheet mechanics. Once you understand this layer, you stop wanting to sell everything the moment it moves. Selling becomes the least interesting option available to you, but that is only the first layer. The next question is, what happens when the asset itself becomes productive? Because access alone isn't the end goal. Productivity is where compounding gains a second engine. At some point, holding an asset is no longer the most intelligent use of it. That doesn't mean you sell, it means you stop letting it sit idle. There's a big difference between speculation and productivity. Speculation depends on timing. Productivity depends on structure. In mature financial systems, capital doesn't sit still. It circulates, it provides liquidity, it supports transactions. And in exchange, it earns something for its availability. When an asset is used as part of settlement infrastructure, liquidity itself becomes valuable, not ownership transfer. Liquidity access. And if institutions or payment rails need XRP temporarily to facilitate movement, then the value isn't just in holding it, the value is in allowing access to it under controlled conditions. That's where structured lending enters the picture as a concept, not as a gamble, but as a function. Lending is not about giving something away. It's about maintaining ownership while allowing temporary use. When that use is tied to real economic activity, the asset can generate return without being consumed. This is where people tend to make mistakes. They hear words like yield and lending and immediately think risk. Risk is real. Counterparty matters, duration matters, structure matters. But productivity does not automatically mean recklessness. The goal is not to chase the highest return. The goal is to make capital functional while preserving control. When an asset is both appreciating and productive, time starts working differently. You are no longer waiting for a price event to justify ownership. The asset is already justifying itself. Now, this is where discipline becomes the divider between people who build longevity and people who eventually blow up. Productive capital requires rules. It requires risk limits. It requires an understanding of exposure and the reality that safety is a design choice, not a hope. Done correctly, productivity adds a second dimension to wealth. Appreciation handles growth. Productivity handles sustainability. And when those two layers exist together, the conversation moves beyond income and into systems, because now you're not just accessing liquidity, you're not just earning return, you're building a framework that can support itself. And that brings us to the flywheel, which is the part most people never connect. Wealth stops being linear when you stop thinking in straight lines. Most people are taught a straight line model. You earn, you save, you invest, you sell. That model works for stability. It rarely produces freedom. Freedom comes from loops, not lines. When you understand loops, your question changes. You stop asking, like, how much does this make? Like, you start asking, like, what does this feed? Here's the flywheel in its simplest form. You own an appreciating asset. Ownership is preserved. That asset gives you access to liquidity without liquidation. That liquidity is deployed into cash flowing assets. Cash flow supports your life and can service the liquidity access. And all of that can happen while the original asset remains intact. That is the flywheel. Borrowed liquidity is not the goal, it's the bridge. Productivity is not the goal, it's the stabilizer. Cash flow is where the system becomes livable. This is how people end up with lives that don't look fragile. Their lifestyle isn't dependent on selling something at the right moment. It's supported by systems that keep moving whether markets are exciting or boring. If XRP reaches structural relevance, it can become a foundation. You don't need it to pay your bills directly. You need it to support the things that do. Cash flow assets are not flashy. They are dependable. Businesses, equity stakes, real estate income, licensing, media properties. Those things don't trend well on social media, but they quietly fund freedom. When liquidity sourced from appreciating assets is deployed into cash flow systems, the entire equation changes. You're no longer working for money. Money is circulating to support the structure you designed. And here is another subtle piece that matters. The flywheel does not need to spin fast to be effective. It needs to be stable. Stability allows patience. Patience allows compounding. Compounding allows time to do what effort never can. Now, we also have to talk about custody and execution because as you scale, the game changes again. Most people experience markets through a retail interface. Click buy, click sell, accept slippage, accept spreads, accept the lack of discretion. But when you start thinking in systems, you start thinking differently about how you hold assets, where you hold them, and how you execute. Execution matters, slippage matters, discretion matters. At a certain size, you realize that operational structure is part of wealth. Wealth is not just the asset, wealth is the architecture around the asset. Now let's tie this back into the bigger environment we're in because none of this exists in a vacuum. We are in a period where regulators, institutions, and infrastructure bodies are all looking at the future of money movement. When those conversations happen simultaneously, it usually signals one thing. The old system is not efficient enough for what comes next. That is why digital asset frameworks are being debated. That is why tokenization narratives are accelerating. That is why settlement upgrades are a priority. Financial systems do not redesign themselves unless they have to. So when you see infrastructure become the topic, it's not entertainment, it's necessity. And that is why structure matters more than hype right now. If you understand that, you stop getting distracted by daily headlines and you start focusing on what's actually changing underneath. Because when an asset moves from the margins into infrastructure conversations, its role changes. It is no longer just something people hold. It becomes something systems account for. And when systems account for something, ownership starts to matter more than excitement. That is why this conversation around XRP continues to evolve, not because everyone suddenly agrees, not because the price already did what people want, but because the context around money itself is shifting. And once you see the shift, the question of how do I make money becomes incomplete. The more relevant question becomes, how do assets function inside a changing system? Do they sit idle? Do they require constant exits? Or do they support liquidity, access, and continuity? Those distinctions are subtle, but they are decisive. Now let's get very practical because this is where people either level up or they stay trapped in reactive behavior. Wealth is not built by being right once. It is built by designing systems that do not depend on perfect timing. Selling has its place, profit-taking has its place, liquidity has its place, but those are tools, they are not strategies. If you build your entire financial life around exits, you stay reactive. If you build around ownership, access, productivity, and cash flow, you gain control. Assets are not lottery tickets, they are leverage points. And once you understand how to preserve ownership while accessing liquidity and building cash flow, money stops being something you chase, it becomes something you manage. That is the difference between reacting to markets and positioning within them. Now let's go deeper into the institutional and regulatory layers, because that's where the XRP narrative either becomes real or it remains purely speculative. Institutions don't move based on excitement. They move based on mandates, risk frameworks, and utility. They need clarity, they need compliance, they need liquidity, they need operational reliability. So when you look at XRP through the lens of institutional adoption, you're really looking at one core question. Can it be integrated into real financial workflows in a way that reduces friction? If the answer is yes, then the demand profile changes. It becomes less about retail sentiment and more about structural usage. That doesn't mean price only goes up in a straight line. Nothing does. But it does mean that ownership can carry a different kind of long-term value. The value of being part of a network effect that is tied to settlement efficiency. Now here's why that matters for you as an individual. Retail investors often think the only way to win is to sell at the right time. Institutions win by holding positions that become embedded into systems. They don't need perfect timing, they need enduring relevance. That's why the institutional angle is not simply about whether banks like something, it's about whether a piece of technology becomes part of the default rails. When something becomes a rail, it becomes harder to replace. It becomes part of the architecture. Architecture creates durable demand. Now let's bring in the regulatory layer, because regulation is where most narratives get distorted. People treat regulation like a mood, like a headline, like a daily soap opera. But regulation is really a process of integration. Markets that start as unregulated experiments eventually either get absorbed into the mainstream or pushed to the edges. Absorption requires rules. Rules create clarity. Clarity creates institutional participation. This is why regulatory evolution matters more than any single enforcement headline. It is not about drama. It is about the system deciding what can be used, where, and by whom. And when a jurisdiction defines a framework for digital assets, it is effectively saying this is now part of the financial landscape that is structural. This is also where timing matters, not for trading, but for understanding. If an asset moves from ambiguous status toward clarity, the range of participants expands. More participants means deeper liquidity. Deeper liquidity means lower friction. Lower friction means more usage. More usage is the beginning of structural demand. Now let's connect that back to your wealth strategy. If your strategy is only, I hope it pumps so I can sell, you are playing the shortest version of the game. If your strategy is, I want to own assets that become structurally useful, you are playing a different game. You are playing the game of optionality. Optionality means you have choices. You can choose to hold through cycles. You can choose to borrow when opportunities arise. You can choose to deploy liquidity into cash flow assets. You can choose to build a system that doesn't depend on market euphoria. And that's the point. Freedom is not about the highest number on the screen. Freedom is about not needing the screen. Now we need to talk about the short term, because even the most macro-driven approach has to respect the fact that markets move in waves. Short-term crypto markets are still liquidity-driven. That means central bank posture matters, risk appetite matters, dollar strength matters, yield curves matter, global liquidity matters. When liquidity expands, risk assets breathe. When liquidity contracts, everything becomes fragile. So in the short term, you should expect volatility to remain the default state. You should expect narratives to swing. You should expect people to be overconfident at tops and terrified at bottoms. And if you're building a wealth system, your job is not to emotionally follow that. Your job is to use it. Volatility is where positions are built, not where positions are abandoned. In the short term, the most important question is whether the broader liquidity environment is supportive. If liquidity is flowing, speculative assets can run. If liquidity is tightening, the market demands patience. Either way, your advantage comes from thinking in structures, not in moments. Now let's talk about the long term, because the long term is where the wealth conversation really lives. Long term, the digitization of value transfer is not going away. The world is moving toward faster settlement, lower friction, and programmable finance. Tokenization is part of that. On-chain settlement is part of that. Interoperability is part of that. Regulatory frameworks are part of that. The system is not choosing whether to modernize, it is choosing how. And if XRP becomes a meaningful component of that modernization, then the asset can sit in a different category over time, not merely as a speculative token, but as a liquidity tool with embedded relevance. If that happens, then your wealth strategy should evolve accordingly. Instead of obsessing over exits, you begin designing around ownership. Instead of asking, how do I sell? You ask, how do I build an ecosystem around what I own? You think about custody, you think about execution, you think about tax efficiency, you think about risk management, you think about how liquidity access can be used to acquire cash flow assets. You think like a balance sheet, not like a trade.